Hey everybody, this is Addison Berry and you're listening to the Osio Labs podcast, the show that explores the question, how can we create sustainable businesses that care for people and make the world a better place? And today's episode, it's just me going solo today. This is episode 2, and I wanted to talk a little bit more about the podcast and also about starting a podcast. It's its own special journey. And I've hosted podcasts in the past, but this is the first time I started one from scratch, sort of from an idea in my head. And it's been a little bumpier of a road than I anticipated. Nothing insurmountable. We're here. The podcast is out. But I wanted to talk a little bit about how it was getting this podcast started, some unexpected twists and turns, and just a little bit more about what my hope for this podcast in the future is going to be. So I guess just to start, I started thinking about this podcast last year, back in 2022. And it came about because I was lining up a number of blog posts that I wanted to write on our blog. And I realized that what I really wanted from those blog posts was comments and conversation. And I thought that maybe having a podcast where I could actually talk with other people, have guests on the podcast, and really share ideas was actually more what I was after. And so that's where the idea for turning that into a podcast and what the topic of these blog posts was and what the topics on this podcast are going to be relate to what does it mean to be a business that survives in a capitalist world yet is human and wants, to take care of people, to take care of the planet, to be responsible, to be sustainable. Because classically those two things don't go together very well, and it can be a frustrating space. A lot of business talk is frankly just not the way I want to run my business. So I wanted to create conversations around the ideas that interest me, and that has to do with things like sustainability and making businesses that serve people instead of having people serve business. I have all kinds of topics. We started the podcast out talking about values, and we have some book chats coming up where I read a book with some other folks from my team, and then we get on and just sort of talk about what did we learn from that book. Was it a good book? Sort of being able to bounce those ideas around. And then I just have all kinds of topics that have to do with things like, human schedules. Like there's a lot of 4-day work week conversation. We have a 4-day work week at Osio Labs. But even that, like seasonal rhythms, what is this like structure that we're trying to put our work time into? Things like mental health, mindfulness, diversity, equity, and inclusion, for sure. A lot of big topics to dive into there. We are also an open books company where we share financial information with everybody on the team, and I feel like there's a lot to be explored in terms of applying this idea of openness and sharing in a business and making the functioning of a business a community project with the team instead of a top-down experience. And then things like environmental impact of businesses in the world, post-capitalism, regenerative economies. Like, are there other ways that we can have an economic system that doesn't drive us to use up all the resources of the planet and the people on it? These are the kinds of things I want to talk about. So that's just to give a rough overview of sort of things I'm thinking about, what I was thinking when I started the podcast, and where I would like to go with things. Mostly, I just want to explore all this stuff, and I really want to have conversations with people. So if you're interested in this stuff, you should definitely subscribe and check it out. And at the same time, if you have something you want to talk about, I would love to have you on the show to talk about some of these things. Or if you have suggestions of topics or books or something like that that you think would fit within this general realm, I am all ears because I really want to explore all of the angles that we can find on this. So that's the rough background on the podcast itself and sort of where I'm coming from. And in terms of this specific podcast, I decided a podcast would be great. And I have hosted podcasts in the past, but I hadn't actually started them. So this was brand new. I had to come up with a name. And it is called the Osio Labs podcast, but it was originally called Business for Humans because I felt like that sort of encapsulated where I was coming from and what I wanted to explore. I wasn't sure if that was like a good name or not, but at a certain point I had to settle and I was like, this is the name, I'm going to do it. And I did a whole bunch of looking to see what was out there, and there wasn't a whole lot of stuff. There certainly weren't any other podcasts or anything like that named that. So I settled on that. I created some branding for it. It took me a little while to get the first episode recorded. It's a long story. We did 2. The second one we didn't like. We're going to redo it. There's a whole bunch of things going on there. So it took me a little while just to get it together. We have some other big projects going on at work. And so I finally got the first episode edited, ready to go, all the branding, all the stuff set up for the podcast host. And I published the first one, actually, last month, back in April. And it turned out that somebody else did have a podcast with that name. They had started a Business for Humans podcast literally a few weeks before I published my first episode. So I hadn't seen it from the time I checked, and then, whatever, 6 to 8 weeks of working on things to get it set up, and then publishing it. In that period of time, someone else published a brand new podcast called Business for Humans. And I noticed it because I was searching for hours, and this other one came up, and I was like, uh-oh. So I unpublished the first episode and went back to the drawing board to sort of figure out what to do. I simplified the naming of things by just calling it the Osio Labs podcast. It doesn't have quite the same zing to it that I wanted, but it works. I know it's a name that we can use and nobody else is going to take because it's our business name. So I just went with that so that I could just keep moving and get the podcast out, which is the more important thing to me than the name of it. So anyway, we ended up delaying getting our podcast out by a few weeks because somebody else came along and took the name right under my nose. So we lost the name, but we still have the podcast. And actually, I went and listened to the Business for Humans podcast because I was like, hey, that's a great name. I wonder what she's talking about. And she's talking about many of the same things. So it's by a woman named Jamie Gennaro. And she's got quite a few episodes out. She puts hers out once a week. We're going to go every other week here. So if you're interested in these topics, I also honestly think maybe you should check out her podcast as well, because she talks about a lot of the same things and has some interesting guests and such like that on her podcast. So, maybe out there in the future, maybe I can have her on our podcast and we can talk about it. But we'll see how that goes. So this is just a super short podcast episode to give you the skinny on how we got things started and where I think we're going. And check out the first episode if you haven't already, where we talk about values, which is a really fun discussion. And then the next episode that's coming up 2 weeks from today is going to be a book chat with one of my colleagues, Blake, to talk about the book Wolfpack. So anyway, I hope to see you all in the future, and please subscribe and let me know what you think. Thanks for listening, and let us know if you have questions, comments, or suggestions for what you'd like to hear more about. You can find all of the various ways to reach us on our website at osiolabs.com. That's OSIOLABS.com. Also, please make sure to subscribe to the podcast on your podcast provider of choice. We'll catch you on the next episode.